Hello and welcome to New Europe Studios, where you can watch us make the news. I am Marita Drica.
And I'm Alexandros Karanakis, and thank you for tuning in to This Week in New Europe, in which we bring you the most important stories of our print edition. Our cover story for the week looks ahead at the European elections. In Cross Purposes.
The fate of Europe is in the hands of the voters. Two upcoming elections will decide the shape of the future Europe. The European elections to be held at the end of May and the Scottish independence referendum. Next, for our editorial.
Monet Matters looks at the idea of a Eurasian Union. Has it finally arrived? What exactly is the Eurasian Economic Union, and what are its potential consequences? Read the full story on page 2 of our newspaper. We move east now, where fighting in the Ukraine continues as the IMF pledges vital help.
Fighting in Ukraine has been increasing over the past weeks as separatists are seizing town after town. This has led Ukraine to launch its first large-scale counter-offensive, trying to push out pro-Russian insurgents and reclaim seized government buildings. Next, Indonesia's optimal trade with EU.
July 9th marks the day in which Indonesia will elect its new president. In an interview with New Europe, Indonesia's Vice Minister of Trade, Bayu Krishnamurti, talks about the trade relations between Indonesia and the EU, describing them as optimal. We move back to Ukraine now to look at Europe's role in the Ukraine tragedy.
Joschka Fischer, the former German foreign minister, looks at the role of Europe in Ukraine's tragedy, showcasing the three acts that led to the current situation.
Natural gas remains a hot topic as the crisis in Ukraine shows no signs of slowing down. Putin's move, South Stream to Austria.
As sanctions against Russia are expanded, Putin keeps making his own moves. Last week, Austrian oil and gas company OMV and Russian gas monopoly Gazprom signed a mutual agreement on the construction of the Austrian section of the South Stream gas pipeline. This construction will allow over 30 billion cubic meters of Russian gas to be delivered to Austria. Next, Russia mulls new LNG ships and plant in Crimea.
Russia is considering options to build a new fleet of LNG transport ships in Crimea to make sure that the shipbuilding companies in the region, as well as at Sevastopol, are working at full capacity.
Now moving to the Far East, Chinese cities for modernizations.
Last week, the IMF increased China's growth prospect for 2014 to 7.5%, and it appears to be well grounded. China is modernizing, going from a rural agricultural society to a modern urban one, with well over half the Chinese population already living in cities. The urbanization approach is a real-life field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. Certainly rings true in China. And now we move to this week's Knowledge Network. Kazakhstan's significance for the European Union and Central Asia, by member of the European Parliament, Justina Bernard. Bernard says that the European Union is wrong in its approach to Kazakhstan and should stop with its stereotyping of the country, saying that it's time for Brussels to come to grips with the full potential of modern-day Kazakhstan, and not only for economic reasons. Next, Jaswant Singh, former Indian Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs and Defense, writes about India's next foreign policy.
India is set to complete its marathon election this month. A new government is expected to assume power at the end of May. With a new government comes revised foreign policy. Right now, the content of this foreign policy is still unanswered. Next, Putin versus Turchynov by Greg Austin.
One is Commander-in-Chief of Russia's military, the other is Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces. Greg Austin, Professorial Fellow at the East-West Institute, looks at how the two match up, or mismatch.
In our weekly stories, getting lost is an art.
In this week's Constructive Ambiguity, Andy Carling looks at getting lost in an urban environment, case in point being the city of Brussels.
In this week's Energy Insider, Kostis Kyropoulos looks at how US sanctions are bypassing Russia's energy majors by blacklisting several top figures in the Russian gas and oil industry, such as Rosneft chairman Igor Sechin, but not doing anything about the organizations run by these individuals. The cancer of Europe, over-indebtedness.
Economist Philippe Kotsoridis looks at how European nations are in over their head when it comes to debt, even if they have stabilized. Meanwhile, the IMF has stated that it's necessary to cut public spending further. More on this story in this week's Economist's Lab. New Europe Studios was host to a number of guests over the past week.
Russia's customs union makes no economic sense without Ukraine.
An interview with former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko and EESC President Henri Mulls.
Every movie is a political discourse.
An interview with French-Greek filmmaker Kostas Gavras.
Art in a public space.
An interview with Gavin Wade, director of East Side Projects in Birmingham.
We end with this week's shooting gallery.
In an attempt to lessen tensions between the EU, Russia and Ukraine, Putin offers a replacement seat for the European Parliament in an unused space that is large enough. How will Brussels react?
These articles and many more can be found on neweurope.eu. Thank you for watching This Week in New Europe. You can find links to all the articles and interviews below this video.
Follow us on your favorite social media to stay current with European and world affairs. And as always, you're welcome to come on down to New Europe Studios on Pleasure down in Brussels, where you can eat, drink, relax, and watch us
Make the news.